The reason we're all here today as we launch this initiative is because we realize there needs to be action to bring food systems metrics together. The time's come for the food system to be truly accountable as we push into the next generation. And the people speaking today are going to present it with far greater clarity than I ever could. So let's move on with the show. First up today, we have Lise Colyer, who is the person who's made all this happen. She's the founder and executive director of OmniAction, as well as food systems news site Quota Media. She originally mapped the OmniMetrics to human rights in a campaign focused on the United Nations Food Systems Summit. She's very much been the driving force behind this initiative and really inspired a lot of hearts and minds to gather behind the OmniAction cause and create a better food system. She's also ensured, as the name suggests, this is a movement about action rather than talk and hot air. So over to you, Lise, to introduce OmniAction.
Thank you. Right, let me see if I can remember how to share screen. Here we go. Is that, whoa, is anything happening? No.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. Sorry, everyone. Let's try again. Oops, thanks.
There we go. That's it. We can see now.
Great. So, hello, everybody. Sorry about being so incapable there. I'm Lise Colyer. I'm the co-founder and exec director, as you just heard. And welcome to OmniAction. This is us. You'll find us at omniaction.org. And when I say us, this is our launch team. You'll meet us all today, including our brilliant advisor, Emeline. And although, you know, we're just launching today, there's quite a lot to tell. And the best illustration of this really is you, our audience. Those who've registered number about 200. You're from all corners of the world and all corners of the food system. And the other thing you have in common is that you're all active, improving and progressing food systems outcomes. To bring you all together is an absolute privilege, and we thank you for being here. Our aim, to borrow a phrase from someone I know is in the audience, is to create a portfolio of expertise, experience, and insight from across the food system to deliver the urgent change that's needed, to break down the silos that many of you have been restrained inside. Uniquely, we're bringing together environmental scientists with labor rights lawyers and campaigners for the respect of Indigenous traditions, land sovereignty image mappers, farmers, nutritionists, and representatives from some of the world's biggest food multinationals. We have UN agencies represented, consumer groups, and many more. We began, as Gavin said, by aligning the full human rights impacts of food to the UN SDGs. This was them. And then we mapped those 5 sets of metrics. Then we mapped these 5 sets of metrics that we've come up with. So that's where it all began, really. And Gavin can include the link in the chat, so if you're interested, you can go and have a look. So of course, though, when really clever people like Emeline and others here today heard about it, they pointed out that before you can actually have a label, you need to have an infrastructure for collecting the relevant information. And for that, you need a framework. So that's what we are all doing here today. We're setting out to create the framework. But why? Because everyone I interviewed as the editorial director at Quota Media, no matter what country they were in, no matter what their role was in the food system, they all said that things cannot go on. Things have to change. The only problem being there is no set of agreed parameters. So, you know, what are we tackling here? The fact is, this is an audience of experts. So on one hand, I don't need to remind you. On the other hand, we're here to join the dots between the siloed areas of the expertise that you represent. So many of you have spoken to me recently to say you're coming along today and signing up to participate because you really hope that it will change things. We'll hear from Emeline, who, with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, unpacked figures from the UN Food Systems Summit Scientific Committee, saying that this sector creates unaccounted costs amounting to twice its value. That's a tab that is picked up in an extra healthcare burden. It's shouldered by the undernourished families of underpaid workers and farmers who are struggling to produce in the face of climate change. Investors, financiers, and business executives know that this off-booking of the true cost of food cannot and will not continue indefinitely. But how do they prepare for change? In the meantime, consumers, quite rightly, in exchange for their hard-earned money, want brands to help them be more sustainable. It's not an unfair expectation. Sue Davis, which unfortunately is unwell today and can't join us, but she would like us to make the point that they have research around this, and we'll share these links in the chat, showing that this is what consumers expect, and as I said, quite rightly, from the brands that they buy from. But as long as there's no globally accepted framework, companies are left to choose what they will reveal. We've got Cliona Howie here from Foundation Earth, who's going to explain how their scientists are immersed in environmental calculations and what a full ecosystem could and should include. IKEA, for example, is very open about saying it doesn't include the processing, transportation, or storage calculations in the climate impact of its plant ball, which is promoted as having 4% of the climate impact of a meatball. Now, the climate-friendly version of a meatball is an important step by a company reportedly selling 1 billion meatballs a year. So IKEA are not bad guys, but consumers are very confused and they're becoming cynical. Our co-founder, Anya, is going to show us how different our perception of some food products would be if we had access to all the relevant information and not just some of it. There's a lot of attention on the environmental impact of our food choices. It's extremely welcome to see how fast the pressure has grown in this field. But while it's the job of scientists and others to get the data right in this field and lay the groundwork for businesses to make meaningful commitments, we have the issue of labour rights operating on a concurrent track and at an entirely different pace. Again, we can share some links around, what's going on here, but the fact is these standards have been long determined. We all know what labour and child rights are. What's missing is independent monitoring. It's the only action which will nudge companies into addressing this in their supply chain. Some great benchmarking is going on with the World Benchmarking Alliance, who we'll hear from today. They found that only 2 of the world's biggest 350 food and agriculture companies are fully committed to paying a living wage throughout their supply chain, meaning the situation is really quite desperate when it comes to child and forced labour. One of the key commitments from OmniAction is to simplify what has long been presented as complex, allowing so-called complexity to become an excuse for opaque and unethical practices. So here's one example from Australian mining magnate Andrew Forrest, who's now working at UN level on renewable energy. In 2017, he said, "I knew that I had slavery in my supply chains. I just couldn't prove it. So I pressed a button." And the button that he pressed was an affidavit he required suppliers to sign, forcing them to disclose whether slavery existed in their work practices. He just got on and did it, is what I'm trying to say. Another live example that we were discussing earlier is food businesses or businesses generally expecting an improved eco rating because they use electric vehicles. And this, of course, ignores the devastating labour, child and eco impact of mining for precious minerals that those vehicles require. So we need full systems coverage here. When we say land tenure, land sovereignty, what do we mean? And again, as with all our metrics, actually, we welcome you to join a relevant committee and ensure the answer to this question is as correct as it can be at all times. I'm talking about direct and obvious examples such as land theft or use of tribal lands without permission to, say, illegally raise cattle in the Amazon. There's no food label telling me that's how my hamburger was sourced, as well as disparities such as preventing people by law from traditional fishing and hunting practices, which are vital for supplementing food supplies. If you live in parts of Alaska, for example, it means that food's traveled a long way to get into those supermarkets, and that puts those prices way beyond the financial means of many people. And I'm talking about the impact of climate change caused in one part of the world that prevents food from being sourced in another through fire, drought, floods, or the melting of ice caps. These human rights need to be folded into a mechanism that helps consumers to avoid unethical practices. UN scientists have said that protecting the land rights of smallholders, women, and Indigenous people is paramount, and they've recommended blockchain ledgers of ownership rights to allocate land. We know also that nutritional metrics can be improved and further rolled out globally. In particular, the food matrix impacts are hard to find in labeling, indicating which combinations are needed for nutrition to be fully absorbed or efficacious. And food safety standards are under threat in the UK with new trade deals being done, but standards resembling those as high as ours in the UK and in the EU remain yet to be adopted throughout the world. So what's the opportunity? DEFRA is going to be responding to the food strategy in England, and that will cover labeling, we hope. Our co-founder Tim is going to speak to how keen we are to help facilitate there. The upcoming EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is another. What you can see here is a snippet from a letter by Share Action, the UN convened Principles for Responsible Investment and asset manager Schroders, among others, who were signatories to a letter about this. The directive is going to require more than 50,000 firms to provide a non-financial statement on a series of ESG-related factors. And in practical terms, what that means is that data for these need to be collected from January of next year. And there's, of course, the EU Farm to Fork strategy, among many others, and we will speak to those. So realistically, what can we, this very modest band, actually do? The first thing to do is dispel a couple of misunderstandings. We are absolutely not in the business of meddling with proprietorial data sets. We are absolutely not, no way, getting into the weeds with you guys at that level. But, you know, how do we help you to explain things like, you know, using electric vehicles will not get you a better eco score? You know, where does anybody actually turn for guidance on this? And where does anyone turn when a client business wants to remove water usage or waste from an eco assessment to help them get a better score? There's no way you can turn to say that these things actually have to be here. Barry Callebaut's, the enormous chocolate supplier, reported 21,000 child workers in its supply chain in the financial year to August 2021. But its competitors are not so open about numbers. So how does it benchmark action on this to its investors? How does a policymaker stand firm when they're presenting the opportunities to be had in mandatory reporting of key data at farm level? So what we're going to set out to do is create the North Star in terms of parameters, a global agreed framework that everyone can turn to and say, that's what we should be aiming for. That helps best practice, not only at a high level, but also in terms of defining what data should be collected and how government regulation can support this. You know, in terms of why we think this can create an impact, we look, for one example, at GDPR, which is protecting the human right to privacy for EU citizens. The fact is it's seen by customers globally as the gold star in protection. So multinationals set their standards to GDPR rather than deal with the inefficiency of different standards in different markets. Interoperability, particularly in global supply chains, is key. So how are we going to do this? Well, firstly, we're going to set out the reasons why things like labour and land rights need equal billing to environmental impact, nutrition and food safety, as I've just discussed. We're going to call it the Charter of Total Food Impacts, and it's going to be setting out the theory of our framework, which we seek to have adopted by all agri-food actors when setting, monitoring and measuring sustainability impacts. It sets out why a framework acts as a North Star and why it's needed on a global level. I'm inviting all of you to feel free to send me your documentation, your thoughts, your case studies, anything that should be captured in this. You've all got my email address. And this will also lay out how we as a group, through a coordinated effort, can, in the most practical sense, act to support the various action tracks required. And then this is what we'll do. I've pretty much touched on this. There's no need for me to really kind of, you know, talk through that. But what we're proposing to do is then to set up 3 committees, which will be environmental and food safety, nutrition, land and labour rights. And the point that we do want to make clear is, you know, that you shouldn't forget that what we're aiming to capture is the natural crossover with these groups. So we'll have people in our audience who would like to see the very high nutritional value of their pasture-fed beef represented properly on a label. You know, none of the relevant values can be found for that particular product right now. Likewise, the poor nutritional quality of oranges grown in bad soil. You don't see that anywhere. And the food safety and social risks of ingredients grown to standards in one country that aren't legal in others, possibly using illegal pesticides or labor practices, for example. So join us. You'll find a link on our website. We'll dump the link in the chat. Do join us. We'll kind of direct you into the relevant committees to help to steer our work. And we also invite you to consider funding our work. OmniAction is producing this framework as a public good to be made available for free to all actors across agriculture and food. We're a not-for-profit community interest company registered in the UK. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lise. Amazing overview there, and all of the links that Lise talked about in the chat. So if you want to join us, you'll find the links there, as well as many of the articles that she talked about too. So next we'll move on to Anya Doherty, and Anya is the Director of Data at OmniAction. She's been with us from the start, as well as being a founder of Food Steps, measuring the environmental impact of food from farm to fork, since graduating from Cambridge. As one of the bright stars of tomorrow's food system, she's making a vital contribution to the omnimetrics needed to make this happen. So over to you, Anya.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Can you hear me and see what I'm presenting?
We can.
Okay, fantastic. And thanks very much, Lise. So yeah, great to see everyone here, and really excited about launching OmniAction. I'll be going through a few slides on my perspective from environmental impact calculations for food companies. So as Gavin said, over the last number of years, I've been working with food companies to help them to measure, reduce and communicate their environmental impacts. And I think there's a lot of kind of crossover, as Lise said, in terms of the different kind of silos which everyone is in at the moment. So I won't spend too long on this because I think Lise has really done justice to it, but in a short way, why do we need a North Star framework? Well, I think the first answer comes from food affecting so much of our world and society. There's nothing new there, and I'm sure everyone's aware of all of that. From where I sit, I do see a massive proliferation of approaches for accounting for the environmental impacts of food. So we look at carbon, land use, water use, and other environmental metrics. But there's lots of different LCA approaches with different system boundaries. There are people using different criteria and different certification-based approaches. There are lots of single metric approaches and quite a small number of multi-metric approaches. But unsurprisingly, what happens in the absence of robust legislation and consensus is that we're really in a situation where we're experiencing a race to the bottom when it comes to impact accounting. So it is easier to do LCAs badly. It is easier to cut corners. It is easier to choose to put fewer items within your assessment. And so therefore, in one way, what can we expect from that system? We can expect people to essentially take the easier route and not look at the whole impacts. And also from where I sit, I do think that the wrong people are currently having the decision-making power when it comes to reporting impacts on food. And I would include myself within that group, because as a consultant working with food companies, lots of people like me are not really actually incentivized to provide the most transparent and bigger picture information, because we're incentivized to, in a way, do what the client wants. And it's really hard acting in that space without having a North Star framework, because it means that you don't really have a leg to stand on when kind of pushing companies to account for wider impacts. And I think that's really where Omni can come in. So just to illustrate this, I wanted to give two real examples from my work where having a North Star framework would make a real difference. And this is a piece of work that we did looking at Bassa and Alaskan pollock. So working with a fish company who wanted to decide how to move forward with a more sustainable fish approach. And when you choose a small number of metrics like carbon, land use and water use, I think anyone in this situation would go for the bottom fish, the Alaskan pollock. It's looking really good on a carbon basis and land use and water use. And again, without a North Star framework, such as OmniAction, it's really easy for a company or a consultant to just come in and say, hey, let's measure these three things and not look at the bigger picture. But in reality, this Alaskan pollock and where the company was sourcing it from, if you look one step beyond just these 3 metrics, you would very quickly find that this is actually a critically overfished population with plummeting stock levels due to really poor regulation in that particular area in East Russia. And you know, I think it sort of is a no-brainer that we're in a situation where we're just missing out the actual reality of the decisions that we're making. And I think it is a real risk that we go ahead without a framework and continue to make really poor decisions based off of limited information. Here's a second example. So I've hidden what these 2 items are. I've got item 1 and item 2. And I think, again, if you were kind of presented with this data, just looking at the carbon footprint and the land use, you would say, okay, maybe item 1's looking like it's got a bit of a higher carbon footprint, but overall they're both quite low impact. When you look across other indicators like the sugar content, which is a key driver of the obesity crisis, item 1 is doing terribly. And also when you look into things like child labour risk and land occupation risk, again, there's a massive disparity between the 2 items. And these, yeah, just for reference, are sort of case study examples of sugar and strawberries. And again, just really trying to speak to the point here that if we don't have a North Star framework where we can push for a holistic accounting approach, we will absolutely be in a situation where we're just picking and choosing the ways to make all different food items look the best and not looking at the whole picture. The final slide for me is just really the question about the state of the data. So assuming that we do want to do this holistic approach, I think the big question on people's mind is, well, can we actually achieve that, and what does the data look like? And I do think that data is a challenge here, but it is getting better and better. And in a busy 4 years that I've had working with food companies on environmental impacts, we've reduced the cost by about 5 times for doing a full farm to fork assessment. And really that is driven by the demand for food companies to have that work done. And currently I feel like there's a lot of time and energy being wasted with uncertainty around frameworks and methodologies. And we need governments to help us to drive consensus around these data and methodologies. But first of all, they and everyone needs to adopt a single framework that we can agree on. I think there's a huge opportunity here to harness the moment. There's a massive amount of improvement that has already happened and is continuing around data and data collection, places like RAP, WWF and University of Oxford. But yeah, what I really think kind of at the bottom line is that the data will only improve if we ask it to. So we need to come together and agree on a framework, and that is what will drive the data to improve. But at the moment, as I said, I think there's a lot of time and energy being wasted around that uncertainty. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening and having me, and really happy to follow up with any questions from my presentation.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Anya. And brilliant examples as well. I think they kind of really very, very clearly demonstrate why this framework is necessary, you know, to understand the wider impacts. And just for everyone in the audience as well, after the event, we will be sharing a recording of this on YouTube, as well as the various slides as well, if you want to refer back to those. So you'll be able to go back to those examples. So next up, we have Professor Tim Lang, who is Emeritus Professor of Food Policy at City University of London. Tim unlikely needs much introduction to most of you in the audience, as dare I say it, the doyen of UK food systems, and has been our chief evangelist of the OmniAction cause since the beginning. His background, ranging from farming through to the highest echelons of food policy, has seen his immense wisdom guide the OmniAction process. In fact, since he first started campaigning for an Omni label well over 10 years ago. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Gavin. Can you see my screen? This is very low tech compared to all singing, all dancing slides. But I've basically thought by now it would be useful just to very simply say, pick this word framework. We keep, and Anya was using it a lot, and Lise also. OmniAction is calling for a new framework. If I wanted to be pompous academically, I would say it's a multi-criteria framework. We don't just think of the future of a good food system as one which is good for nutrition or good for the environment. It's got to be both, plus labor, plus X, plus Y, etc., etc. So what you end up saying, well, is it all too complicated? Well, the answer is no. This is why you need a framework which agrees what those criteria are and the broad goals that we want from food system. And that needs to be translated down to very simple consumer-friendly policy mechanisms like labeling. So I thought I'll just say very quickly 10 reasons why framework thinking is what we need. And the first is, by framework, we're really talking about a code or the word framework is a code for getting a new consensus about the baseline for what's required from the food system. The second reason is that the criteria for judging good food and a good food system are inevitably complex. Never believe anyone who says, this is terrific because X or X plus Y. It needs to be the whole alphabet, or else we're not dealing with the reality. Lots of benchmarks need to be pulled together. Thirdly, essentially for the public, for the consumer, for the end user, the urbanized way away from the sea or the farm, the public interest requires a simple, accountable, and coherent system that needs a framework. And fourthly, it needs to be a public framework, not a private framework, to stop food information being a commercial fight out. There are signs of that already, by the way, across different countries and different markets. People saying, no, we only want to have a carbon label here. Exactly what Anya was getting at the end of her talk. The fifth reason we need a framework is that it's a good way of getting different interests together. I'm someone who's worked most of my working life to try and take animal welfare more seriously within public health. They're flip sides very often of the same coin. But it's very easy to just argue that leave things to the animal welfare movement, or leave things to the fair trade movement, or leave things to the fair labor or wage issues. The reality is what consumers want is a decent food system which tries to tick all of these boxes. So a framework is a way of getting those interest groups together. The sixth is that actually we know, I speak as a very boring academic, we know the complexity of what is meant by and is in the food system, and we know most of the challenges that are already clear. We don't exactly know how climate change is going to work out. We don't exactly know what will happen if we continue to degrade soil in different parts of the world, but we're pretty clear that we reverse those. But what we've got to do actually is bring those into a way that makes sense of those for consumers. Most consumers haven't a clue what goes on in the farm or at sea. We've got to have something that brings those together. The seventh reason is a complicated one. And in fact, this webinar proves it. No one country operates within closed borders. The British, rightly or wrongly, chose to leave the single market in the European Union where it had been for half a century. And yet now you'd think to many people who voted for it or like it, you'd think that somehow Britain's autonomous. No, it isn't. It's actually heavily fed by the European Union, indeed wants to export to the European Union. Food flows across borders. So a framework is the way to stop standards, food standards, becoming intergovernmental, international battlegrounds. The eighth reason is that a framework allows for different modes of information trial. At one level, OmniAction is taking, if you like, liberal capitalism at its word. Everyone in big business, small business, economists say, well, information flows is a very important factor which makes markets work efficiently. So we're saying, okay, well, why aren't consumers given this information? Why, when companies have got that information, isn't it being shared? And companies don't often actually have all the information that they think they do. The Center for Food Policy, where I've worked for 30 plus years, we've done research that's shown that. Companies think they know, they maybe got the price of their ingredients, but they don't necessarily know the package that comes with that set of ingredients. And the ninth reason is that the old blocks, what Gavin in his introduction of me referred to, 10, 12, 15 years ago when I was arguing, many others around the world were arguing for this kind of omni-action approach. The argument was, well, we haven't got the technical infrastructure to enable that to be shared. That's no longer true now. We've got QR codes. We've got disclosure happening. We've learned indeed through the COVID how that sort of use of QRs in everyday life can be part of everyday consumer and public behavior. And the 10th and final level is that this is a strategy and a way of thinking about frameworks which is already emerging. So my argument is that OmniAction is pushing at an open door. At the EU level, for example, it's already emerging, not just from the farm to fork strategy, but the Green Deal strategy. Indeed, to the OmniAction team, I've just sent a briefing showing extraordinary things that are emerging now through the Green Claims Directive, which will undoubtedly emerge in the next year or so. And the EU is going to be launching in 2 months' time an entire new strategy, which is essentially an OmniAction approach. What we need to be doing is making sure that that OmniAction approach is genuinely an OmniAction approach, or if there are bits missing, which there will be, that the process that is set up enables that to be revised in a way that benefits and helps consumers. So those, I think, are 10 reasons. I sat down and tried to think, if I was briefing a minister, what would be the 10 reasons that I think the minister should sign on to an OmniAction approach? Well, those are them. Gavin.
Amazing. Thank you, as ever, Tim. Incredible argument to show why now is the time for action, specifically OmniAction, I think. So with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Emeline Fellus. She's a director at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and she's been an advisor to OmniAction since our inception. Her laser focus is intensely directed towards providing healthy, enjoyable diets for all, produced responsibly within planetary boundaries, and her advice has been invaluable in the development of OmniAction. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Emeline.
Thanks a lot, Gavin, and thank you, everyone. I suppose you can see my slides. Let me just put them on a slide mode. Right. Thanks a lot. So I would like to first of all congratulate your team for the amazing initiative you're taking. And I think the numbers and the facts that you've been sharing are self-explanatory, and there is a tremendous opportunity for us to indeed make a big change, I think, through this agreement of a common framework and then pushing it towards different audiences and users. I was asked to provide a bit of a perspective indeed in relation to also the concept of true value of food, which has been promoted at the United Nations Food System Summit a few months ago. So this is just a reminder with a few pictures showing a few of the major challenges that our system is facing. And in fact, these can be actually expressed in terms of numbers, monetary numbers, of what is called externalities, which are not taken into account by today's accounting systems. So if you want, there has been this amazing study that has been made, which presents actually the externalities, which is the costs, or in fact, the value that is created by our entire food system in the world, compared to, in fact, the market value that it is creating. And as you can see here, there is a big gap between actually the value that we're creating and all of the costs that we are generating. The costs that are in general, actually, within 3 clusters. Of course, the cost to the environment, we've talked about it, but also the socioeconomic costs, and finally, the health costs, which are growing actually every year. So when you think about this, we actually think that there is a way to change the system, which is actually to change the way business accounting and investor evaluation models are actually accounting for all of this. And this is the concept that we have, and this is the reason why we published a number of reports recently on the concept of the true value of food. As our CEO and president puts it, securing the application of the true value of food represents a unique opportunity to create the awareness and incentives for the big transformation intended for food systems. So I'll take an example. This is in the report that I just talked about. We've worked on these numbers with actually BCG, which has been helping us a lot on the work we did on the true value of food. If you take, in fact, a chocolate chip cookie and an oat porridge, and then you go into the details of all of the related benefits and costs, then this is what you get. You can actually calculate, and it's been expressed earlier by Anya and by others as well, you can calculate all of the different costs and put numbers around them with regards to the different environmental, social, and health KPIs that you choose. So this is the concept, I think, of the Omni framework, in fact, which I'm happy to see being put in action, because in the end, this is what we're aiming at, and this is the vision that in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where I work, we're really trying to push. We're trying to push to provide healthy and sustainable diets for all, which means actually that from production to consumption, we need to activate those 4 buckets and be able to actually deliver food to everyone that is nutritious and affordable, food that is consumed sustainably, food that is produced while restoring and safeguarding nature, and making sure that the value chains are prosperous, equitable, and free from human rights abuses. So there will be a lot of discussions in the future as to which KPIs we use for those different buckets, the 3 committees that Lise has been talking about, but that's going to be the essence of the rest for us to be able to progress in terms of how we communicate and how we're able to move all of the different stakeholders from producers to consumers without forgetting policymakers and the finance stakeholders. So I'll stop here and look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emeline, for that. And we're also going to have a comment now from Carla Hommes from the World Benchmarking Alliance to follow on from Emeline's presentation. Are you there, Carla?
Yes, unmuted now. Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to share my screen and also put up some slides. Can you see them?
Not yet, no.
Does it work now?
Something's happening.
Right.
Yeah, we've got them.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. First of all, also congratulations on behalf of the WBA to the lounge, and thank you very much for the invitation to also present and have a couple of minutes today on this lounge event. So I'm Carla from the World Benchmarking Alliance and want to present and give an overview of our food and agriculture work at the WBA. Maybe just super quick in terms of what is the World Benchmarking Alliance, what's our purpose, what's our approach. If for everyone maybe not familiar, so the World Benchmarking Alliance intent is really to incentivize companies towards the SDGs. We have done so by selecting a group of focusing on keystone companies, so really multinational leading companies, and we have translated the SDGs we know which are not formalized and shaped fully for the private sector into 7 systems transformation, and the food and agriculture system is one of them, because we firmly believe, I think amongst all others on this call, that we need to see a rapid food system transformation to be able to achieve not only Paris, but the whole agenda we are looking for. And like we've also heard multiple times today, it's not just one-sided. So social, nutrition, environment, and also from a company perspective, governance and strategy aspects play into this. So it's really an OmniAction approach, you could say, what we feel as WBA as part of a corporate agenda for food system transformation. So what what our benchmark, or what as part of food system transformation we have done, is this food and agriculture benchmark. There's also spotlight benchmark focusing on specific sectors or specific topics. But the core work, what I described today, is that we have assessed 350 of the global leading companies across the full value chain. So really from agricultural inputs all the way to the fork, all the way to restaurants and food service companies. You see the 6 value chain segments in the bottom. And as I mentioned, critically 4 measurement areas you see here in the circle. And the companies we assessed are headquartered around 41 companies. So we really try to have a global picture, although as you can imagine, European and American companies, if we look at size, influence, and impact, are a bit like weighty in the Americas and in Europe. And we overall looked at looked at 45 indicators across these measurement areas as a really holistic approach. Maybe worth adding as well that WBA has worked over more than 3 years together with multiple stakeholders to come up with that methodology, to come up with a consensus on what is relevant for the private sector, which we then synthesized into 45 core indicators. And today I just want to present because in 2021, last year, we did the first assessment on the methodology. We launched the methodology in the beginning of the year, and then went through a massive research task in analyzing how are the 350 companies performing according to this methodology, and have presented our first results at the UN Food System Summit in 2021. And here you see, and today I just go through a couple of core findings, of which Lise, I think, politely mentioned a few already. So you will see here the top 10, and interestingly, the top 10 includes 5 out of the 6 value chain segments. So what this shows to us is that what we expect can really be done, because there are business who take this step, and there are business who really demonstrate that a holistic approach is possible, and that, for example, not just food and beverage manufacturers can work on nutrition topics, but also companies more up the value chain. And for example, for fertilizer and pesticides, it's the other way around. It's not just upstream companies, but we also can require and should require responsibility and action from downstream companies. So that was the positive part, I think, just proving that this common ask and this holistic ask is really what we should expect and can expect. The drawback is that overall companies are not on track to we can show this here, that overall companies are not on track for food system transformation. So we really see worrying gaps. And you see this on this figure here to the right. So 350 companies, only 65% really fail to score even a quarter of the score. So there's a massive just really showing that many companies need to step up their efforts in many of these areas. And now just diving into the 3 dimensions of social, environment, and nutrition. And I've selected a couple of key facts and outcomes. So on protecting human rights and labor rights, we see that really only 8% of the 350 companies do have a comprehensive human rights due diligence, which means identifying, assessing, and then acting on human rights. Likewise, we see that more than half of the companies, so 202, do not explicitly require the prohibiting of child labor in their own operations and in their supply chain. And even more worrying, 304 of the 350 companies do not have comprehensive measures for forced labor. So this, to put it frank, is absolutely absolutely not on track and worrying and not standing up to a world where we say that leaves no one behind. Likewise for living wage, numbers are striking. So only 9% of the companies are taking steps towards paying a living wage, and only 2% of the companies, Lise were referring to this before, only Unilever and Mars, so one palm oil company, they have really, they can prove and show and are transparent about paying living wages to their workers. Farmers and fishermen resilience there. I think, most of us, we know that 2/3 of the population living in extreme poverty are working in the agricultural sector or are their dependents, yet only 54 of the companies commit or have activities to support the resilience of farmers and fishermen. And only 8% of companies demonstrate a move towards ensuring living incomes for farmers and fishers, despite the urgency that also climate change has very negative effects and just makes their life a lot more difficult.
Carla, could I just interrupt? If you could aim to wrap up shortly, it'd be really appreciated. Sorry to interrupt there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just two more, I think, key outcomes that we found are that companies are not on track for, the, according to Paris, so only 26 companies or can show that they are aligned with a 1.5 degree agenda. 188 haven't even set a scope 1 and 2 emission target. And then on the nutrition aspect, and we can also say that nutrition or nutritious diets are not a consumer choice, because 80% of the companies assessed have no statement or no strategy to make nutritious foods more accessible and affordable. So that has been my last slide, and I wrapped up quite quickly, but please go on our website on the World Benchmarking Alliance, and under Food and Agriculture Benchmark, under this link, you find all information. We look forward to provide further information, and we also are grateful that this work feeds into the work of OmniAction and all you're doing. So I stop here.
Many thanks, Carla, and we'll endeavour to share all of the slides that everyone's presented after the event as well. So, moving on, we'll now hear quickly from Cliona Howie from Foundation Earth. Cliona, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Gavin and Lise, for the invitation to be a panelist today. It's my honor and pleasure to be part of this. For a lot of reasons, and I think the case has been set very, very clearly already by other speakers. So I won't go into why we're here today. I think we all understand the challenges. We all understand the work that's being done on this. Foundation Earth, exactly this, was created as an independent non-for-profit for many of the reasons you've heard today, right? That we need some kind of harmonized approach on food labeling. This needs to be credible. It needs to generate trust and transparency. It needs to be multi-criteria, obviously science-based. There's not really much point in saying that. And we work on global supply chains. So thinking about this from one perspective of a geography, for example, makes no sense to anyone. So I think it was Tim that say food crosses borders. So why would we only think inside borders? Perhaps in an ideal world, we would work on regional ecosystems and only produce and consume within a regional ecosystem, but that's not our reality. And I don't think it will be in any of our lifetimes, unless COVID does its dirty tricks with us and brings us back to where we should be, but that hasn't happened. So Foundation Earth came into this space to tackle some of the challenges that have not been tackled yet. And some of them, again, have been mentioned today. Harmonized approach. If we look at this from a business case, businesses don't want the admin and the bureaucracy of having to deal with different standards, different papers to fill out according to geography. If we look at the consumer reasons to do this, they deserve to have the full story communicated to them on what the impact is. They also have a human right, if we're talking about human rights, to know what they're putting in their body. And environmental impact is health impact. And that has been more than demonstrated and validated with COVID. So in a post-COVID world, we truly understand that what's happening out there on our natural resources comes and impacts us directly on our health. My voice is also a bit hoarser from COVID. I don't know if it's here to stay or not, but it changes us, right? For good and for bad, but definitely it's for us to be measuring and to know how it affects us. So Foundation Earth is setting out to do that. We're also setting out to change. Someone was talking about feasibility. We cannot know where those thresholds and boundaries should be if we don't measure it with robust data. Now that data, today speaking, has to include scope 3. We can no longer talk about transformative systems change by looking at scope 1 and scope 2. It's actually, in my book, considered, it's almost an oxymoron to be even saying that in one sentence. Transformative change means the full story, including scope 3 emissions. It is feasible. This is not a question of, oh, it's not feasible, you're trying to break down brick walls. No, my God, we put a man on the moon a long time ago. This is feasible now. The databases have been created all over the place, both public and private, and we can link up supply chains to bring that data into telling a full story, into an eco-label that robustly and fully tells the story of where that environmental impact is. And that's one of our standards at Foundation Earth, is pushing the boundaries where other scores have not pushed the boundaries, because we know this is feasible and we believe it's the right thing to do. Finally, this has to be democratic, right? This has to be accessible and scalable to all. We're talking about global supply chains. So Foundation Earth is looking to tackle that challenge as well, and is looking at hypermodeling, which brings, how do you create incentive? And I think Anya used that word, but how do you create incentive across the whole supply chain from farm to grave? So forget farm to fork, farm to grave, the whole full supply chain. How do you create incentive across all actors, across all nodes, across all tiers of that supply chain? So it's not just the product owner at the end of the day who gets that merit and that award of, isn't my product wonderful? But let's bring value to everyone who's involved in creating a sustainable product, down to farm level, where they are the land stewards of our environmental natural resources, and they need to have value from an environmental score. So that's what Foundation Earth is set out to tackle. We cannot do this alone. I think that we all know that collaboration is the word of the century. Collective collaboration for true transformative change is what's going to make this feasible. It is feasible, but we do have to come together. So from Foundation Earth's perspective, we couldn't be more supportive of this approach of Foundation Earth is not looking at other impacts right now, just environmental. But like I said, nutrition is linked to environment, and in thinking about social, it's all linked. So we believe in a systems approach to this, and bringing it together is the right way forward. We're very happy to be here. We're very happy to contribute to this, and we encourage you to get in touch with Foundation Earth if you want to know more. I think a lot of people are leaving things in the chat about, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? Our philosophy, I think, is similar to OmniAction, full open arms to collaboration. Absolutely want to raise the bar on how do you bring transparent conversations to be able to bring collective action to one mission together. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Cliona. And yeah, I love that approach, bringing people together, but for action rather than, just going around in circles. So it's an incredibly important point. Next, we have Hélène Papper from the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Are you there, Hélène?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been extremely interesting. Again, my name is Helen Pepper. I am the Director of Global Communications Advocacy at IFAD, which is a UN agency dedicated to helping smallholder farmers improve their livelihoods while also building resilience to climate change. And so it's really fantastic to see all of these partners come together to help fix our food systems, to change the way companies behave, the way consumers make choices about the companies they support, and to echo what everybody's been saying, 360-degree approach is absolutely fundamental. The systems approach to making sure that we all work together and break down silos is key to actually making impact. Most of our food globally is produced in rural areas, as you may know, and while most rural households rely on food systems related activities for their livelihoods, despite the agricultural achievements that we have seen, abject poverty does remain stubbornly concentrated in rural areas where livelihoods are deeply dependent on food systems. We have economic insecurity, unacceptable working conditions that continue to characterize the livelihoods of too many who work in food systems. Inadequate incomes are a major cause of the disturbing situation whereby around 3 billion people in the world today cannot afford healthy diets. We have low, unstable, insecure incomes that are especially prevalent among those working in our food systems. And that's leading to the perverse situation that many of those who produce the world's food are themselves vulnerable to suffering from hunger and malnutrition. Protecting land sovereignty, land tenure, labor rights is therefore essential to ensuring that smallholder farmers producing so much of our food are able to eat properly themselves. It's a circle, and that circle must be addressed. IFAD is indeed taking that omni approach to addressing food systems because we really believe that agriculture needs to also provide decent livelihoods for the people who work within them, especially the small scale producers, the women, the men who harvest, process, store, and market our food. IFAD also has supported projects which enable women, youth, indigenous peoples, other groups who are often overlooked in development processes to receive decent returns for their work. So we are really aligned with any initiative that ensures that smallholder farmers are being protected and treated fairly throughout supply chains. But I think there's much more that farmers want beyond good working conditions. We recently launched a Farm Radio International project that gathered feedback from over 3,000 farmers directly from 6 radio stations in 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Tanzania, and Uganda. And it's really important to have that input directly from the farmers. So what did they say? They said they want better access to loans and credits, to inputs, better markets, more information, as well as better training on farming techniques, better management and business management. Women farmers in particular emphasize the need for access to loans, to credit, and financial support is vital for the success. Many respondents, interestingly, also noted specific concerns about the effects of chemical pesticides and fertilizers on the safety of food. They emphasize the benefits of an agroecological approach and basing food production around local farming systems. So I think it's extremely important to not forget that we need to go back to the local knowledge and to leverage that local knowledge as we bring together and make decisions, that we come together and make decisions on the future of our food systems. Because without listening to that source, we're going to miss out on the fundamental knowledge that comes from the populations themselves. And so before I close, I'd also like to raise the issue of climate change, which is further impoverishing smallholder farmers and challenging land sovereignty. At present, we have just 1.7% of global climate finance that's directed to help small-scale farmers in developing countries adapt to climate change. IFAD's mission today is to change that. IFAD is committing to ensuring that at least 40% of its core resources are dedicated as climate finance between 2022 and 2025. That is extremely important to keep in mind. We have to see how we're going to all get together and make sure that that message is clear for decision makers and to make sure that we work together on this. So thank you again for this opportunity. I think it is extremely important for us to be bridging the gap the way that we are and starting to really talk to each other so that we find global solutions that reflect all of our different expertise and needs. So thank you again for having me.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen, for joining us. And we're going to move on to Paola Totaro from Founded Place. Paola, are you there?
Leanne.
Hello.
Hi. Well, I was hoping that Lise would be doing a Q&A, because I was brought in very much as a journalist, and really to talk about an experience of establishing a news site specifically to try and bring some of these related issues into the global discussion. So, Lise, if you can ask the questions, I'd be really happy, because it's been a while since.
No, I'm sorry, Paola. We shouldn't have made it look as though we were throwing you in the deep end here. But one of the reasons I really wanted you to join us today was because of the experience you had of what I felt at the time was probably a little bit too groundbreaking, actually. The fact that you were setting up an entire reporting outfit based on looking at the importance of land tenure. It was a very overlooked subject at the time, and I know you came across it wasn't the easiest thing to do, and I know that you must have personally been quite shocked, actually, as you started to uncover some of these stories.
Yeah, look, it was an extraordinary 2 years of my life as a journalist. In 35 years of covering issues across the world, I had 2 years when I was absolutely immersed in this, what I think, and I still think, is a silent crisis, really, which is the fact that approximately 3/4 of the world's population simply don't have any way of proving their property right. So you could be a woman who has farmed land for 3 generations, and somebody can just come across and push you off, because there's simply no framework and no capacity, technology, piece of paper to prove that you own it. And this was something that I simply didn't know. I had no idea, for example, that Africa, 90% of Africa is undocumented. The land is undocumented. People work it, they own it, they live on it, but they have no way of proving that it is land that belongs to them. And the other extraordinary thing is that women produce half of the world's food, and yet women own less than 20% of the land that they farm. So these were all things that I knew nothing about. And our aim was, I thought, if we as a group of journalists, I should add that the amazing Omidyar Foundation, who do a lot of work in this area, funded it. It was a project that was done with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who obviously do some fantastic, reporting on the developing world and very unreported areas. And so for 2 years, I think by the end of it, certainly by the time I left, we had probably 1,200 stories. We'd established a network of journalists across the world who were coming back to us with stories about this very unknown aspect of inequality in the world. And I guess I would argue, having listened to you all, how important it is that it's added.
But I mean, as I said, I felt at the time it was very ahead of its time. And did you feel as though you were able to make a difference with this news? I mean, obviously the first thing to do is report this stuff, and that was absolutely vital, but were people listening?
I think, look, over the period that we established this, we went all over the world. We did some really quite interesting projects in informal settlements around the world. We showed these tiny economies that live, that thrive in these entirely undocumented communities. I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done, and I know that the Thomson Reuters Foundation is still reporting this with great verve and great vigor. There's still a long way to go, but I think that it's incredibly important, if you are looking at this omni approach, that this type of measure and this type of inequality is mapped and is documented better for the consumer at the other end.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks so much, Paola.
Thanks so much, Paola.
Pleasure.
And we've also got here Terry Collingsworth from IRAdvocates, who's been doing a lot of work around labour rights. Terry, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Thanks, Gavin and Lise, for organizing this. I've been sitting here learning things, which is a good thing at my age, that you can still come in and hear some fresh perspectives. I am usually brought in as the cautionary tale because I have been working chasing the cocoa industry, trying to get them to stop using forced child labor and child labor for well over 20 years. I have 2 lawsuits against the industry. I have a petition filed under the Tariff Act to try to ban the importation of the cocoa. And this cocoa story, I think, really illustrates, one of the real sinkholes of the work that we're talking about, that if you're going to build standards, you need to build in right away. Don't wait for the companies to come later and tell you how they're going to enforce it. Don't trust them. You got to build in your enforcement mechanism and your certification systems with the standard. In the cocoa sector, there's been agreement for years on what the standard is. So that's not rocket science. We have Convention 182, the ILO convention. I think that's the best source of the standard. And it's very clear. In fact, it's so clear that in 2001, all of the major cocoa companies signed something called the Harkin-Engel Protocol, and they promised to implement this Convention 182 in 2001. Since then, they've given themselves 4 extensions of time, and they have now said that by the year 2025, they'll reduce by 70% their use of forced child labor or child labor in violation of Convention 182. They're going to take all the time they can take until we figure out a way to force them to stop. Now, Lise mentioned this false complexity. One of the things they will say is, well, it's really hard to monitor whether there is forced labor or child labor in cocoa production. But what they're really doing is they're intentionally misleading the public. They're saying it's really hard, and then they're paying Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade millions of dollars to give a label that means nothing on this issue. And it's those 2 entities are themselves contributing to they're complicit in allowing the industry to continue to do this. I had the pleasure quite a while ago in the late 80s and early 90s working with Nobel Prize laureate Kailash Satyarthi to set up a system called Rugmark that is now called GoodWeave, that is a certification system for hand-knotted carpets in South Asia. Now that one was hard. We had to get an army of guys on motorcycles and bicycles to ride all over India to identify the looms that are hidden in barns and sheds. But we did it. And you can look at goodweave.org and see the mechanisms. I won't have time to explain. But that one was hard. It would be very easy. And I've offered a number of times to the cocoa industry to set up a monitoring system similar to GoodWeave that would assure that there's independent monitoring and certification in the cocoa sector. They didn't take us up on that, and they probably never will unless someone makes them agree to this system, because they're getting away with it. And they're going to continue to get away with it until somehow we force them to stop. So the cautionary tale is that don't trust them. Profits are going to drive their bottom line all the time. And that part of the most important part of our work, I think standards are going to be, we could agree on standards for almost everything. Agreeing on how you're going to enforce and implement those standards is the crucial missing step in most of these initiatives. I hope I can work with all of you to try to reinforce that and participate in good new systems going forward. But we cannot just trust anyone to monitor themselves, the fox in the chicken coop. We need to have good, rigorous, transparent standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. And yeah, I like your point about how these things are difficult, but it doesn't mean they can't be done. So we've got Ashish Deo from GAIN as well, who's got some comments to make. Ashish, are you there?
Yep, very much so. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And I'm delighted to be at a conversation which is not just about why do this, but is beginning to sort of move on to how to do it. Because I've been to several conversations that basically stop at discussing why this is all important. And as I think Cliona was saying, we don't need to reiterate that too often. Hopefully, at least most of the people on this call understand why. But the how question is the important question. And I think before I start my comments, which are mainly framed by my experience of working on labeling in the developing countries, which is where GAIN focuses, and how to signal the right choices to consumers. I'm not a technical expert on any of the dimensions that will be part of Omni. I think what we need to recognize is that this kind of a framework cannot be the silver bullet that will solve all these problems. And we've heard from a few speakers where the dependencies have been shown. So for example, the structural issues on property rights ownership, or some of the linkages that Cliona was talking about, they are really, really fundamental structural issues in economies and societies. So it's important to view an initiative like this as one of a range of different things that will be needed to move the food system forward. I think one of the dangers we run into is that we start seeing every new initiative as the manna from heaven or the kind of answer to all our problems. And unfortunately, no single initiative can live up to that. So that's just one. I think the second piece I would say, and this is where I kind of flip into my consumer orientation, is that what we are discussing here is the classic analogy of an iceberg. Yeah? The visible 1/10 needs to be something simple enough that the consumer can understand and act on. The remaining 9/10, which is under the water, can comprise all the complexity and the rich comprehensiveness that the multiple dimensions and methodological issues and data issues and all that kind of stuff. It's really, really important for us to not forget that the top 1/10 has to be something which is understandable and actionable. And therefore, my plea is to always remember that what an ordinary consumer looks for is guidance, not information. And there is a difference. Very few people will have the time to engage with all the richness of the different types of information that all these dimensions will comprise. We need to find a way to express it in ways that people can take in those 15, 20, 30 seconds, very often that are available for making decisions and still act. So that would be kind of my second plea to not forget. And the third thing I would say is that Tim expressed this very correctly, that when you put together a framework like this, obviously there'll be competing interests. Different experts and different people who care about specific issues, whether that's child labor or environment or land rights, whatever it may be, would want prominence for their dimension or their factor. I think we need to use the consumer as the way to synthesize these. Would this make a difference in terms of their purchases? Would it make a difference in terms of their action? Because unless we do that, it's very easy to get lost in the lobbying power of different interest groups, which are inevitable in an effort like this. Experts are also lobbyists for their own areas of expertise. So I would just strongly urge for the consumer aspect to be not forgotten and to use it as a kind of simplifying mechanism, because people can't absorb the vastness and the richness of information that is all very valid and valuable, but we need to deal with practical life. 5% activists who care about a lot of this information, we can't project their wishes onto 95% of the consumers who don't have that much time or the inclination. So I'll stop there and wish you all very well, because I think this is exactly the right kind of thing to do. I'm very happy to help in any way I can. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for that. It's a very pragmatic approach, but it shows the importance, though, of pursuing these things at the same time. And also moving on, Richard Jordan, are you there with a comment to make as well?
I am. Yes.
Hello.
Hi. 3 quick comments in 45 seconds or less. Speaking on behalf of 1.1 million senior citizens in New York City. Since 1976, 14 year-round and 29 warm weather green markets are set up in New York City parks, allowing farmers from upstate New York to bring their produce to the city, sell the produce to anyone, and keep their farms going. Number 2, any senior citizen during the summer can pick up 4 vouchers at $5 each, totally free, and buy produce in the green markets. Third and last point, New York City senior citizens are, senior centers are the beneficiaries of subsidized produce. And we seniors can purchase 3 home-cooked nutritious meals a day for any contribution from as little as 5 cents to $1, no more than $1. And I hope I'm the oldest TikTok influencer on earth at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that. And at that point, we've got time for a few questions, actually, some Q&A. So I'm just looking through what we've had here. There's a question here from Laura Chan from the Soil Association, who's asked, how is OmniAction looking to work with existing labeling initiatives such as Foundation Earth, EcoScore, Planet Score, and how can we overcome the proliferation of independent labeling systems? So is that something that one of the Omni team would like to talk to?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that if it helps. Yeah. We will we welcome everyone involved in systems like this to get involved and participate. As I said earlier, we do welcome everyone to help to steer us and make sure that we're on the right track. But ultimately what we aim to be is a framework that acts as a North Star to you. So it's really important that the inputs from existing labels are made known to us, in order to make sure that when we're harmonizing all the various attributes of these labels, which are very worthy, they are meaningful, and we really have come up with a North Star that works for you guys. And if you like, sort of brings you into the labeling family, so that you can then work with your suppliers in helping them to look at the other aspects of their the other aspects of what they're doing. So you'll be working in a smaller ecosystem than the one that we aim to influence, but we hope that we're genuinely harmonizing everybody, as I said, under this one North Star. I hope that was a good enough answer.
Brilliant. Yes, that was amazing. So and I'm just looking as well, there's Tim, you're still here. There's some questions from Zoltan, who is asking about, he's saying consensus is needed, but among whom? Multinational industry players, governments, consumers. Is this something perhaps, Tim, you'd like to talk to?
Don't start me, Gavin. The short answer is this is where it gets very difficult. It's right. Let me dive straight into the difficulties. Some people in the small business or say regenerative agriculture world will say, look, big companies being involved and agreeing a framework is very dangerous because they'll crush us. And that's there are good grounds for that argument. Ashish was in a sense hinting at that. But the critical issue that I think OmniAction is trying to bring to this is that our focus is upon the consumption end. No one has the right to determine whose framework becomes the framework. It's got to be a process of deliberation, a process of engagement. And this is my answer, Gavin, and Lise. My view is that has to be the function of OmniAction. It has to try to act as good agent, good facilitator, to ensure that little people don't get squeezed out, that the arguments remain, and that a process of creating, say, Omni labels isn't just sewn up by a small group, a cartel, preordaining what is in the consumer's interest. It's a shame that Sue Davis from the very big consumer organization, Consumers International, the big international coalition of consumers groups, isn't here, because I know Sue would say this. I've worked with her and indeed with which, and Consumers International for decades. Part of the issue is to make sure that a process of engagement occurs that in the end will deliver good for the consumers. And some arguments have been thrown at OmniAction of saying, why are you bothered about labeling? Labeling is the weakest form of intervention. You know, if you really want to get change and you want to get food systems transformation, you go for taxes, you go for the tough end. And that's right, that's where you get change. But if you don't engage with consumers, the billions of consumers who are, as all the talks today have shown again, yet again, in a sense, consumers are kept in the dark, not deliberately, sometimes deliberately, but not overtly deliberately in food. We're not going to get the rapidity of change that we know is needed. We're not going to get change by 2030 or move towards zero carbon. We're not going to reverse biodiversity loss done in the name of food unless consumers are actively brought into the change process. And that ain't going to be done by leaving it to a big cartel, or indeed leaving it to a cartel of small food producers. It's got to be OmniAction. And I will say this because I don't think any of us have said this strongly enough. The clincher for me is that it's got to be states, governments, and coalitions of governments, which are the terrain on which this framework is argued out. And that's why it's really good having IFAD here, Hélène, you here, representing that complexity of the UN. It's not easy, in case you didn't need Hélène to say that. But unless there is a coalition of governments and negotiation between governments and governments being honest brokers within the diversity of food system actors, consumers' interests get lost. So for me, the clincher will be whether consumers' interest in understanding the complexity of the impact that they, all consumers have through the food system and what we eat, if that isn't the outcome of omni-labeling, it will be a joke.
Yeah.
Stakes are very high indeed.
Yeah, it shows to the points to the consumer action being necessary, but the policy end is also very, very sharp as well and very necessary. And which also brings to a second part to the question, in fact, which is about sort of voluntary or legally binding. Is this something that there's any thoughts about?
Yeah, I think Tim might want to pick up on that as well. Or I can see Cliona's hand up actually. I think because we are
mine is very quick to this. Voluntary is always the weakest. Ultimately, if you legislate, it's tighter and everyone knows what the standard is. Ashish and I, anyone, all of us on this call will know that. But the problem is, how do you get it? You can wait years. Let's just take, Lise, the right to food. I mean, the UN in the end compromised and had the voluntary action on the right to food, and that's 25 years ago. And not every country in the world has signed on, Hélène, has it? So in a sense, I think one needs to have, maybe I'm breaking ranks here, but I think you need to have a twin track approach. You want some people saying, well, let's get voluntary framework in place, a voluntary framework of the willing, at least gets the show on the road. But at the other end, there's got to be the green pieces or the hard people, if you like, who are saying it's got to be legal or forget it. And actually, it's a combination of those two which usually achieves the right result, in my experience.
Perfect. That's, yeah, definitely.
What's Cliona's argument?
To come in, I think basically what we're describing here, I think we all know this is all incredibly complex, but we're talking about a systems change. Systems change is a top-down, bottom-up, side-to-side, and every angle simultaneously. Is that easy? No, it would have been done before. I've heard industry put all the pressure and expectation on the consumer, and I don't totally disagree with that, right? I don't believe that all transformative change is consumer-led. I believe that industry also takes responsibility for things. Equally, government takes responsibility for things in setting political boundaries around what's minimum expectations of things is necessary. But from Foundationalist perspective, what we've seen, which is really interesting, and I talked about that scope 3 commitment, right, on quality of data. There is absolutely no obligation right now to be doing that. However, the situation on our planet is changed. We no longer have any luxury of time or access to the raw materials, even at cost, right? We all are paying higher cost for everything. So businesses know this. They've done their financial simulation models. They know what the story is. They know they have to change, and they are demanding this now. They need this data to be able to make change upstream to bring different products to consumers. So I think labeling for the sake of labeling is not anyone's objective. We could label the entire world. What if it's all unsustainable? Who cares if it's labeled or not? The objective here is to empower a label so that it drives upstream change to put better options in front of the consumer, right? We're not trying to label things so that consumers know something's unsustainable. We're trying to put very good options in front of a consumer. So when they're making a choice, it's between two sustainable choices, right? And one might be slightly better than the other. But labeling for the sake of labeling is no one's ambition. But it takes a systemic change. So policy is equally important as business, is equally important as consumer demand, and that all those drivers have to be considered. We haven't even talked about education and awareness. That is absolutely fundamental across the entire value chain of the food system, from farmers to consumers and everyone in between. Increased education and awareness will, without that being a common denominator to everything we're doing, there will be no change, right? My almost 80-year-old mother doesn't truly know what sustainable means, but she does know what good food means and good quality food means, right? So we have to be able to communicate those things in a way that they understand it. I think someone else talked about that earlier, about what communication means and what the complexity of it is. So there's what my main point to make is we have to be always talking from a systems point of view, not placing one lever of change or one trigger at any more importance than the other, but triggering them all simultaneously. And that's why it takes collective action to do that.
And that's a very good point with omni up, down, left, right. It's omni metrics, but it's also omni food system. It's omni everywhere. Now we are due to wrap up now, but Helen, I can see you've got your hand up. Was there something you wanted to quickly contribute?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, and just to bounce off what Cliona just said, which is fundamental. And I think we need to all underline that. The fact that communication is education, is action, is change, is something that really has driven kind of the work that I do across the UN system, not just within IFAD, but a long time in terms of working in the field and making sure that those voices of the populations that are often left behind are brought to the forefront. And that education and that dialogue and that information you get from the populations themselves absolutely needs to feed into the decision-making processes, as well as the global education that Cliona was referring to, right? In terms of educating on what this means, right? What food systems mean, we all have a responsibility within this across the chain, right? In terms of the decisions that we make, in terms of where we put our money, in terms of how we deal with things. And that incorporates the entire chain. And unfortunately, this is not central yet to funding structures, to architectures in terms of our organizations. It's always kind of the last thing, right? It's how do we put the money directly into operations and directly onto the ground, but we forget about the necessity that we have in terms of that education, that communication, because everything that we do, if we don't actually explain it and include that data and all of that information, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just not going to move forward. And this has to do with our food systems. It also has to do with dealing with climate change. It has to do with this fundamental systems change that needs to occur. And so I just wanted to say how important that is and how we need to try to work on pushing that forward together, I think.
Yes, powerful words, definitely agree. And a great note as well to wrap up. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today. And there were comments and questions as well, which we've not got to. We'll keep in touch with everyone after the event. We'll make a note of the chat and the Q&A as well, so we can get back to people if we've not been able to respond to you. We'll also share a recording of this event. This will be on YouTube, and keep the conversation going on Twitter and via social media. So I would like to thank all of our panelists who have joined us today, and the audience as well. Thank you for coming along and supporting us. We really appreciate it. And I think with that, Lise, we've reached the end. So
thank you so much to everybody. So sorry we've run slightly over time. We will be in touch. And as I said earlier, please do sign up via the website, join us, and we will very much be relying on you to help to steer us, to get us where we need to be.
Perfect. Amazing. Have a safe journey back to your living rooms or wherever you're traveling from your computer to, and we will be in touch with you all soon. Thank you for attending today.
Thanks
Take
so
care,
much,
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.